That means the plants will be very heavy even to a very tiny plants. But the special character is flowering. Yes, they all show flowering. That means reproduction will take place. Exclusively sexual reproduction will take place. Now, the image which you can see here is the image of sal tree that grows in Himalayan mountains. And as you know, children, that in Himalayan mountains the climatic conditions vary a lot. There will be extreme cold conditions, but even in those cold conditions also the sal tree performs the process of flowering. That means the plant shows sexual reproduction. Now you can see the giant cactus, and this cactus plant is present in the Sahara desert, and as you know, the conditions in the Sahara desert are very hot. Even in such type of drastic hot conditions, this giant cactus shows flowering, and that means sexual reproduction is also present in Sahara desert plants also. Orchid plants, as you can see, these are very colorful plants, and these flowers are present in the jungles on big trees. They hang freely. Now, even these plants also contain flowers. That means it shows sexual reproductions. And do you know, children, such type of orchid plants we keep in our homes as ornamental plants. Let us study the structure of flower in detail. Now, as you can see the image, there is the transverse section of the flower. Now, in this flower, we will see the sepals, the petals, the stamens and the carpels. Now, children, let us discuss the each and every single part in this image. We call sepals and petals as the non-reproductive parts of the flower, whereas stamens and carpels are considered as the reproductive parts of the flower. Why do we call them as non-reproductive parts? Because sepals and petals do not participate in the process of reproduction. Then these sepals and petals perform some extra function. What is that? Sepals protect the flower when it is in bud condition. That means when the flower is in bud condition, sepals protect the flower. Petals, as we can see, petals are colorful, and these petals help in attracting the insects because the process of pollination must occur. So, petals are colorful and they help in attracting the insects. Now, coming to stamens. Stamens are called as the reproductive parts. In stamens, we have two parts, that is anther and filament. As you can see over here, this bilobed structure is called as the anther and the tube-like structure is called as the filament. So, stamen consists of anther and filament. Coming to carpels, the part which you can see over here, this is called as the carpel. The carpel consists of three parts. The uppermost part is flat and it is called as stigma, and the lower part is nothing but style. The long tube-like structure is called as the style, and the basal part, which is oval in shape, is called as the ovary. So, stigma, style and ovary together form the carpel. So, children, let us know once again, sepals and petals are called as the non-reproductive parts of the flower, whereas stamens and carpels are called as the reproductive parts of the flower. Let us study the reproductive parts, that is stamens and carpels, in detail. As we have discussed earlier also, children, structure of stamen consists mainly of two parts, that is the bilobed structure is called as the anther, whereas the long tube-like structure is called as the filament. And the structure of carpel, it has three main parts, that is the uppermost part is called as the stigma, the long tube-like structure is called as the style, and the oval structure present at the base is called as the ovary. Now, I will tell one more simple point over here to you, children, that is inside the anthers, pollen grains are present, and inside the ovary, ovules are present. So, children, remember that. So, children, inside the anther, pollen grains are present. Inside the ovary, ovules are present. Unisexual flowers. Let us discuss unisexual flowers. So, children, The name here itself indicates uni means one. That means in unisexual flowers, any one character is present. That is either the stamen or either the carpel. Any one can be present. Such type of a flower consisting of either the stamen or either the carpel is called as unisexual flower. And the best examples are bottle gourd and papaya. Bisexual flowers, and the name here indicates bisexual. That means two parts, that is the stamens and carpels, both are present in the flower. So this is called as bisexual flower. The examples of bisexual flower are lily, rose, sunflower, brinjal, etc. Stamens. Stamens are called as the male portion, and stamens are also called as Andresium. Children, this is the new word which you are going to study now, that is Andresium. So stamens are also called as Andresium. And what do the stamens do? So the stamens produce male sex cells in the pollen grain. So children, as I have told you all earlier, inside the anther, pollen grains are present. Yes, pollen grains are nothing but they are the male sex cells. So inside the pollen grains, male sex cells are present. So stamens are called as Andresium and they produce male sex cells in the pollen grain. Carpels. The female portion is called as Gynoecium and they produce female sex cells in the ovary. As we have discussed just now, that stamens are called as Andresium and they produce male sex cells in the pollen grains. Similarly, carpels are called as the female portion, that is the gynoecium. They produce the female sex cells and they produce in the ovary. Let us know the differentiating points. Stamens and carpels. Stamens are the male portion, carpels are the female portion. Stamens are called as the Andresium, whereas carpels are called as gynoecium. And the parts of the stamen, it consists mainly of two parts, filaments and anther. Carpels consist of three parts, that is stigma, style and ovary. Children, here you should understand one major point is, inside the anther, pollen grains are present. That means pollen grains consist male sex cells, whereas in ovary, female sex cells are present. Pollination. Transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma is called as pollination. Now, in this pollination, we have two types. What are they? Self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now, children, you might get a doubt that pollination means transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. How is this transfer taking place? So, the transfer takes place in many ways. Rain, wind, animals, insects, ants, etc. help in the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. Now, let us see what is self-pollination. So, self-pollination, this is the part where the pollen grains are present. We call it as anthers, and from anthers, the pollen grains are transferred to the stigma. And when you see this part, the anthers which consist of the pollen grains, they are transferred from the one flower to another flower. So, what is that we can observe here, children? That the pollen grains from anther to stigma will transfer on the same flower, and the pollen grains from one flower will get transferred to the stigma of another flower on the same plant. That means the pollination process is taking place on the same flower or on a different flower in the same plant. This is nothing but self-pollination. Cross-pollination. As you can see the image over here, children, the pollen grains of one flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower, whereas the pollen grains of this flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower. That means the transport of the pollen grains takes place in different flowers on different plants. So this is cross-pollination. Let us observe pollen grain. As we have discussed earlier that the structure of stamen consists of anther and a tube-like structure, that is filament, and inside the xanther we are having pollen grains. Now let us observe the pollen grain. As you can see over here, this wave-like layer which is present on the oval structure, that is called as the exine, and towards the inner side this layer is called as the intine. Inside the intine we can observe the pollen grains. Now the pollen grain, after a due course of development, it develops pollen tube. As you can see, the tube-like structure is nothing but pollen tube. Now you should remember one point over here, children, that is, inside the pollen tube 2 nuclei are present. You have to remember how many number of nuclei are present in the pollen tube. 2 nuclei are present because these 2 nuclei play a major role in the fertilization process. So once again, let us observe pollen grain, that is, the outer wall is called as the exine, the inner layer is called as the intine, and when the course of development takes place, the pollen grain breaks and forms a pollen tube. Inside the pollen tube, nuclei are present and the number of nuclei are 2 nuclei. Let us study the structure of ovule, that is nothing but the carpel. It consists of the stigma, style and ovary. Now we are going to study the ovary part. So when you can see this ovule, it has outer integument and inner integument, and as you can see over here, the narrow part is called as micropyle. Next is embryo sac. In this embryo sac, the major development of fertilization will take place, and the embryo sac is surrounded by nucellus. Children, you have heard correct, that is nucellus. As you all come across nucleus, but over here nucellus is present. I will tell you what is the difference between nucellus and nucleus. Children, nucellus means it is the nutritive tissue which provides nutrition to the developing embryo sac, whereas nucleus, it is present inside the cell, and nucleus consists of the genetic material, the DNA. Now I hope you understood the difference between nucellus and nucleus, as nucellus is the nutritive material, whereas nucleus is consisting of the genetic material. Now in the ovule we are discussing about the nucellus. Next, the basal part is called as the chalaza, and the chalaza continues with the funicle. So this is the structure of the ovule. Let us study the embryo sac 7-celled 8-nucleated stage. So the embryo sac consists of 7 cells, 8 nucleated. How is that possible? Because as you know, children, that if there are 7 cells, the nucleus also should be 7, but over here we are having 8 nucleus. So let us know how this division is taking place. Now this is the structure of a cell in which 2 nucleus are present. That is the initial stage of the embryo sac. The embryo sac which consists of the 2 cells. Children, this is the initial stage of embryo sac, and in the initial stage of embryo sac 2 nucleus are present, and they are present freely without any cell membrane formation. Now this cell undergoes mitotic division. Children, in the process of mitosis, the cell gives rise to 2 cells, that is 2 nucleus are formed. Now as this cell is consisting of 2 nucleus, this cell undergoes mitotic division. As a result, the first cell produces 2 nucleus and the second cell also produces 2 nucleus. So the number of nucleus in the embryo sac are 4. Again, the 4th nucleus stage also undergoes mitotic division to produce the nucleus, that is the double nucleus. So the 2 nucleus undergo mitosis and produce 4th nucleus. So the total number of nucleus present are 8 nucleated stage. And the point which you have to understand here is, children, that there is no cell membrane formation over here. The nucleus are freely evolving in the embryo sac. After the formation of 8 nucleated stage, there comes the cell wall formation, As you can see over here on the upper side, that is the micropylar end, 3 cells are formed with 3 nucleus. On the lower side, antipodals, as you can see, the 3 nucleus are present towards the lower side and we are calling them as antipodals. Even here, the cell membrane formation will take place. Now, the leftover 2 nucleus, one towards the micropylar end and one towards the lower end, that is the chalazal end, the nucleus will migrate towards the center of the embryo sac. So, the upper side is consisting of 3 cells with 3 nucleus. The lower side is consisting of 3 cells with 3 nucleus, whereas the remaining 1 nucleus towards the polar sides are migrated towards the center and we are calling them as polar nuclei. Let us study the diagram in detail. But as you can see here, the antipodal structure has come towards the upper side. So we are calling that as the chalazal end. And the chalazal end consists of the 3 antipodals, that is the 3 cells with 3 nucleus, and towards the lower side, if you observe, we have 2 synergids with 2 nucleus and 1 egg cell, it consists of 1 nucleus. So these are the 3 nucleus. And as you see over here, the finger-like projections on the synergids are called as filiform apparatus. These filiform apparatus help in the movement of the pollen tube towards the egg cell. That is, the filiform apparatus help in directing the pollen tube towards the egg cell. So children, please remember that the 3 cells developed are the antipodals towards the upper side, and the 3 cells developed towards the lower side are 1 egg cell and 2 synergids, and the remaining 2 polar nuclei develop into 1 central cell, that is, in 1 cell 2 nuclei are present. So 3 cells towards the upper side plus 3 cells towards the lower side and 1 cell consisting of 2 nuclei. So it is 7-celled 8-nucleated stage. Now let us know the fertilization in angiosperms. Children, in this image I will tell you how the pollen grain will move towards the embryo sac. As the stigma part of the carpel contains a lot of sticky substances, that is, the stigma secretes sticky substances which have lot of sugars. As a result, the pollen grain reach the stigma and it attaches itself to the stigma. Over the stigma, few chemicals are released. As a result, the pollen grain will break at its tip and develop pollen tube. And we discussed earlier that the pollen tube consists of 2 nuclei. The style directs the pollen tube towards the embryo sac. So the 2 male nucleus which are present will reach the embryo sac. As we have discussed this image earlier also, that towards the chalazal end antipodals are present, in the center central cell or the polar nuclei are present, and towards the lower side 1 egg cell and 2 synergids are present. This is nothing but the structure which is present in the lower side of the carpel. The male gamete consisting of the 2 male nuclei will reach towards the embryo sac, that is this part of the embryo sac. So children, we discussed earlier that the pollen tube consists of 2 male gametes. The first male gamete will fuse with the egg cell. The first male gamete will fuse with the egg cell to form the zygote. And the second male gamete present in the pollen tube will fuse with the polar nuclei or the central cell. As a result, the first male gamete fusing with the egg cell form the zygote. The second male gamete fusing with the polar nuclei will form primary endosperm nucleus. In short, we call it as PEN, that is primary endosperm nucleus. Now, over here we can see the zygote is formed, that is the first male gamete fused with the egg cell form the zygote. The central part is nothing but the PEN, that is primary endosperm nucleus. This is formed by the fusion of the second male gamete with the central cell, and as a result of this fertilization, zygote is formed and primary endosperm nucleus is formed. Now children, you can observe that there were 2 synergids present. these synergids will degenerate during the process of fertilization. It is the similar case with antipodals also. The antipodals also degenerate during the process of fertilization. Now, the zygote will develop into the embryo. That is, the zygote will swell drastically and it develops into embryo. Children, let us know what is epicotyle and hypocotyle. As you can see the image over here, this is the image of a seed. This seed is covered by a seed coat. When you observe during the process of germination, the seed coat will break, the seed opens and the process of germination will take place. How the process of germination is taking place? How the roots, how the stems are formed? So, we can see over here the major parts, that is the epicotyle, the hypocotyle. These two parts, epicotyle and hypocotyle, help in the development of the seed, that is germination. So, you must have a question that will the epicotyle develop first or the hypocotyle develop first? So, children, hypocotyle develops first, that is the root formation takes place initially. When the root formation is formed and developed well, then the formation of epicotyle will take place. The formation of epicotyle is nothing but development of the leaves towards the upper side of the soil. So, epicotyle and hypocotyle help in the formation of root system and the shoot system in the developing seed. So, let us know the development of epicotyle and hypocotyle in detail. As you can see over here, the epicotyle and hypocotyle, these are the two cotyledons. That is, when the seed will germinate and break, these are the parts which are present inside the seed, the hypocotyle and the epicotyle. As I told you all, the hypocotyle will develop the root system. So, you can see over here that roots are well developed because of the hypocotyle, and the epicotyle will develop the first leaves. Seed germination. As we all have discussed till now that the process of fertilization and the male and the female parts of the plant, let us know the process of seed germination. Let us start from here. This is a healthy plant consisting of the flower. Inside the flower, as we discussed, there are male and female parts. In this image, you can observe the female part is the stigma, style and ovary, and male part is the anther. As we discussed earlier, the pollen grains from the anther fall on the stigma and the pollens develop pollen tube, transfer the two male gametes towards the embryo sac. Over here, the process of fertilization will take place, and as a process of fertilization, zygote is formed. Zygote will eventually undergo repeated amount of division and the zygote develops into embryo. As I told you all, embryo will further undergo divisions to form fruit, and the fruit has seeds. Now, when you eat the fruit and throw away the seed, and when the seed reaches a proper environmental conditions, it starts germinating. Nothing but the seed again develops into a new plant. So, children, what we have learnt? We have discussed sexual reproduction in flowering plants. That is, how the plants reproduce. We also discussed the sexual parts which are present in the plant. That is, the stamens which consist of the anther and the filament, and the carpels which consist of the stigma, the style and the ovary. We studied the flower in detail, mainly the parts which are involved in reproduction. As I told you all children that in the flower the reproductive parts are present, non-reproductive parts are present. Reproductive parts of the flower are stamens and carpels, whereas the non-reproductive parts of the flower are the petals and the sepals. Unisexual and bisexual flowers. Children, we discussed that in unisexual flowers, either the carpel or either the stamen will be present. That is, any one part will be present in unisexual flowers, whereas in bisexual flowers, both, that is the stamens and the carpels, are present in bisexual flowers. Cross-pollination. As I told you all children, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma is pollination, and this pollination takes place through many sources like wind, rain, insects, ants, etc. So in that pollination also we have cross-pollination and self-pollination. Cross-pollination, the pollination which takes place within the two different flowers present on two different plants, whereas self-pollination, it takes place on the same plant and of the same species. We also observed the pollen grain, as it consists of the outer exine, inner intine, and that pollen grain undergoes a course of development and pollen tube development occurs. Inside the pollen tube, two male gametes are present. Structure of ovule in detail we discussed. It consists of stigma, style, ovary, and inside the ovary we have a number of ovules. 7-celled 8-nucleated embryo sac. As we also discussed, children, that in the embryo sac, as we discussed, the upper side consists of 3 cells with 3 nucleus, lower side consists of 3 cells with 3 nucleus, whereas in the center 1 cell is present with 2 nuclei. As a result, 7-celled 8-nucleated condition is formed. Then we also discussed the fertilization in angiosperms in detail. Seed germination, how the seed germinates into a new plant and how the process of fertilization takes place in the plant, young plant, and that develops into a fruit, and again the fruit releases out the seed and that seed again develops into a new plant. Children, let us discuss some questions and take these questions as your homework and complete the work and show it to your teachers. So, write about unisexual and bisexual flowers. Define pollination. Mention the types of pollination. Draw the diagram of 7-celled 8-nucleated embryo sac. Explain in detail about double fertilization. So children, do answer all these questions, complete the work and show it to your teachers. For better understanding of the concepts, solve the worksheets. Please visit the official website of SIET. So children, let us meet in another new session. Thank you.